Did Prince Harry just destroy Meghan Markle's royal life forever? It's a question that nobody expected to even whisper within the gilded walls of Buckingham Palace, let alone broadcast to the world. For years, Meghan had been viewed as the modern fairy tale bride, a Hollywood princess who had captured the imagination of millions. But behind the smiles, the red carpet appearances, and the viral Instagram moments, something darker was brewing. A story of loyalty, betrayal, and an explosive revelation that would shake the monarchy to its core. And it all started with a confession Prince Harry could no longer keep private. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine, for a moment, the tension in the palace corridors. The tapestries, centuries old, lining the hallways of Buckingham, have witnessed scandal before, but nothing quite like this. Prince Harry, heir to the throne, standing in a quiet, wood-paneled room, his hands clenched, his eyes betraying a mixture of frustration and fear, finally admits something that sends shockwaves across every member of the royal family. "I told the palace that Meghan no longer represents us. I couldn't keep defending her." Those words, simple yet devastating, would mark the beginning of a chain reaction that nobody could have predicted. It wasn't just about titles. It wasn't just about privileges. It was about trust, reputation, and the very image of the monarchy itself. The implications were enormous: financial, legal, and emotional. Every advisor, every aide, every member of the extended royal circle had to pause, consider, and react. Because once Harry spoke, the course of Meghan's royal journey changed forever. And the public? They had no idea what was coming next. Now, you might be wondering, what could Harry have said to reach such a breaking point? What could have caused a prince, someone whose loyalty to his family was legendary, to step forward and effectively signal the end of Meghan's royal influence? The answer, as shocking as it may sound, lies in a combination of private conflicts, public scandals, and a revelation that some say was inevitable the moment Meghan stepped off the plane in London from her Los Angeles life of glitz and glamour. Let's rewind for a moment. The fairy tale began with a whirlwind romance, a love story that seemed scripted by Hollywood itself. Meghan, an actress with a burgeoning career and a global following, met Harry, the charismatic prince burdened with expectations he hadn't asked for. From the start, the world watched, fascinated. The wedding, held at Windsor Castle, was televised internationally. Millions cheered, millions sighed, and millions, unbeknownst to them, missed the first signs of tension simmering beneath the surface. To the public, it was a dream realized. To the palace, it was the start of a complex challenge. The early months of marriage were reportedly a mix of excitement and friction. The palace is a world of protocol, tradition, and unspoken rules, and Meghan was thrust into a reality far removed from movie sets and Hollywood premieres. Advisors whispered about misunderstandings, small clashes, and moments where the reality of royal life collided sharply with Meghan's expectations. The glittering events, the carefully orchestrated public appearances, and the relentless media spotlight created a pressure cooker environment. Each misstep was amplified, each disagreement noted, and the tension between loyalty to family and personal ambition began to surface. Prince Harry found himself caught in the middle. On one hand, there was Meghan, his partner and confidant, the woman he had chosen to spend his life with. On the other hand, there was the royal family, centuries of tradition, and the burden of public expectation. As weeks turned into months, Harry's role shifted subtly but decisively. No longer was he just a prince navigating his own life. He became a mediator, a buffer, and eventually, a whistleblower of sorts. The inner conflict, between defending his wife and protecting the integrity of the monarchy, grew more acute with each passing day. And then came the fateful private meetings. The ones that were never meant to see the light of day. According to insiders, Harry made it abundantly clear that certain behaviors, decisions, and public actions by Meghan could no longer be overlooked. Reports suggest these were not petty grievances, but issues with serious implications. Public statements that contradicted palace positions, private disputes leaking into the media, and actions that could not only tarnish reputations, but risk the trust of the nation. Advisors, accustomed to the quiet management of royal discord, were reportedly stunned. Harry wasn't asking for guidance anymore. He was delivering a verdict. At this point, it's worth considering the emotional weight of Harry's confession. Imagine standing in a room with centuries of history, aware that your words could alter the course of a family legacy, and uttering a statement that effectively undermines someone you once defended publicly. The courage, the fear, and the inevitability all collided in that moment. And the effect? Immediate. Within hours, the palace was abuzz with strategy, consultation, and careful messaging. Every angle was considered: the legal ramifications, the media narrative, and the response from both domestic and international audiences. But what made this confession so explosive wasn't just the statement itself, it was the timing. Meghan had recently been involved in high-profile ventures, philanthropic initiatives, and public appearances that reinforced her image as a global figure. The public had begun to see her as more than just a princess. She was a brand, a personality, and a celebrity in her own right. Stripping her of titles, privileges, and recognition wasn't merely administrative, it was symbolic. It sent a message, both internally within the royal family and externally to the world. The monarchy maintains boundaries, and no individual, however beloved or controversial, is above scrutiny. This is where the curiosity gap begins. What exactly did Harry reveal? Why did he decide to speak out after months, possibly years, of protecting his wife's image? And how did the palace respond to a revelation that threatened not only Meghan's public standing, but also the perception of the royal family globally? These questions, tantalizing and unanswered, set the stage for the unraveling that would follow. Every subsequent move, every reaction, and every headline would be influenced by this pivotal moment, a revelation that few outside the palace walls truly understood at the time. And here's something that might surprise you. Insiders claim that Harry's admission wasn't merely about one incident or one disagreement. It was a culmination, a pattern of behavior and decisions that collectively undermined trust, loyalty, and shared responsibility. From public statements that contradicted royal messaging to private actions that threatened confidentiality, each event built on the last. And in that quiet, wood-paneled room, Harry's voice broke the chain of silence. It was a confession that would reverberate far beyond the palace gates. Yet, despite the gravity of this moment, the story is far from over. Meghan's supporters might argue that she was misunderstood, misrepresented, or even targeted unfairly. Critics, meanwhile, see this as a long-awaited reckoning. And the truth, as always, is complicated, a web of personal choices, family loyalty, public expectation, and global scrutiny. This is not just a story about titles being stripped. It's about power, influence, and the high-stakes balance between personal ambition and institutional integrity. So what comes next? How did the palace enforce its decision? What were Meghan's immediate reactions, private and public? How did the media respond? And what does this mean for Harry, for the monarchy, and for the millions who have followed this story with fascination and shock? The answers lie in a series of events, meetings, and revelations that we are about to unpack, one chapter at a time. By the end of this story, you will see not just the loss of titles and privileges, but a portrait of a family under pressure, a marriage tested by loyalty and ambition, and a world watching as one of the most sensational royal stories in decades unfolds. And just when you think you've understood the full scope, the truth Harry revealed, and the palace's reaction, will challenge everything you thought you knew. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Did anyone really see it coming? That's the question that has haunted palace insiders, royal commentators, and fans worldwide. For years, Meghan Markle had been framed as the modern fairy tale bride, a Hollywood actress with charm, ambition, and a storybook romance that seemed destined for history books. But fairy tales, as we all know, often hide the darkest twists behind the sparkle. And in this case, the fallout would prove far more dramatic than anyone imagined. From the very beginning, the world was captivated. Meghan and Harry's courtship had every element of a blockbuster romance: secret glances, shared humanitarian missions, and a love story that transcended continents. The media framed it as destiny, the prince who had lost his mother too soon, finding solace and love with a woman from across the ocean. The wedding itself was the culmination of global fascination, with millions tuning in to watch the ceremony at Windsor Castle. Every detail, from the designer gown to the carefully orchestrated procession, was scrutinized, celebrated, and immortalized in photographs. But behind the public celebrations, the palace observed with a mixture of intrigue and concern. Buckingham had seen countless marriages, scandals, and media storms, but nothing exactly like this. Meghan was an outsider in every sense of the word. American, divorced, a former actress, and, according to palace insiders, not fully conversant with centuries of protocol. The initial charm, though undeniable, collided with the rigid expectations of royal life. The first months of marriage, while outwardly polished, were filled with subtle tensions that only insiders could detect. Consider, for example, the small moments that built the foundation for the eventual fallout. Reports suggest that Meghan frequently challenged established norms. Questions about how events were organized, how staff were managed, and how public statements were issued. To a casual observer, these may have seemed like minor disagreements. But within the palace, where precedent and hierarchy are paramount, they represented potential disruption. And Harry, caught between loyalty to his wife and duty to the institution, began to feel the strain. One insider recalls a particularly telling moment early in the marriage. Meghan had expressed dissatisfaction with the traditional schedule of royal engagements, insisting on a more personalized approach to public appearances. Staff members, bound by tradition and protocol, struggled to accommodate her requests, creating tension behind closed doors. For Harry, these small clashes were emblematic of a larger problem, a widening gap between the life his family had always known and the life he wanted to share with his wife. Public perception, meanwhile, told a different story. The world saw a couple in love, dynamic and modern, breaking barriers and redefining the monarchy. Every Instagram post, every public smile, reinforced the narrative of happiness and unity. Meghan's popularity surged, particularly among younger audiences who admired her independence, style, and humanitarian work. But in private, the pressures of royal life began to mount. Media scrutiny was relentless, and every misstep was amplified, whether it was a minor wardrobe choice or a carefully worded comment taken out of context. Tensions escalated as the couple's roles evolved. Harry, long known for his charisma and charm, found himself increasingly frustrated. His position demanded loyalty to the family, the monarchy, and the public, but his instinct was to protect Meghan, to defend her against criticism both internal and external. This dual responsibility created a silent but potent pressure. Each palace aide, each advisor, began to notice the subtle cracks. Harry defending Meghan in ways that were unorthodox, sometimes confrontational, and increasingly visible to those with access to insider information. It was during these early months that the seeds of the fallout were sown. Sources indicate that Meghan's approach, while effective at times in managing public perception, began to create friction internally. There were disagreements over charitable initiatives, conflicts over the handling of sensitive communications, and differences in the interpretation of royal expectations. Harry, often torn between his allegiance to Meghan and his duty to the monarchy, found himself in a position he could not sustain indefinitely. The media narrative only compounded the problem. Headlines painted Meghan as either a victim of a rigid institution or as a polarizing force within the royal family. Supporters celebrated her independence. Critics criticized her perceived disregard for tradition. The palace, meanwhile, struggled to respond without generating further scrutiny. Every move was calculated, yet every misstep seemed magnified. And in the midst of this, Harry's private concerns began to crystallize into a critical realization. Defending Meghan publicly was becoming unsustainable. What many outside observers did not see were the private, confidential communications that began circulating within the palace. Advisors exchanged memos expressing concern over public perception and the potential for escalating conflicts. Letters and notes documented subtle breaches of protocol, growing tensions, and disagreements that were once considered manageable but were now escalating. Harry, observing these internal reactions, understood that the situation had reached a tipping point. It wasn't just about miscommunication or minor disagreements. The palace, steeped in centuries of precedent, saw patterns forming. patterns that suggested a widening divide between Meghan's approach and the expectations of the royal institution. Public appearances that were meant to be harmonious became sources of tension. Statements meant to project unity were dissected and criticized internally. And through it all, Harry's internal conflict intensified. His loyalty to Meghan was unwavering, but his responsibility to the monarchy could not be ignored. The first whispers of potential fallout emerged in private meetings. Insiders report that Harry began warning advisors, quietly and privately, about behaviors he believed could not continue unchecked. He was careful, strategic, and deeply aware of the implications. These warnings, though discreet, marked a significant departure from the typical royal approach of resolving issues quietly and without public exposure. Harry's words signaled a growing awareness that Meghan's public persona, while beneficial in some contexts, was creating internal strain and, potentially, a crisis that could not be ignored. As months progressed, the subtle cracks widened. Meghan's global initiatives continued, but the internal cohesion of the royal household began to fray. The palace had to manage not only external perceptions, but also internal morale. Staff members, aides, and close advisors became increasingly aware of tensions that had previously been hidden. Harry, caught in the middle, recognized that the personal and the institutional were on a collision course. And then came the moment that would later be remembered as the turning point. According to insiders, it was not a public statement or a viral interview that catalyzed the fallout. It was a private, candid conversation between Harry and key advisors, a confession of sorts. Harry articulated, with clarity and emotion, that he could no longer continue defending Meghan in a manner that conflicted with his responsibilities to the monarchy. The implications were monumental. This was no longer a matter of personal disagreement or minor tension. It was the beginning of a decisive shift in the palace's handling of Meghan's role, influence, and, ultimately, her standing within the royal family. The tension, the suspense, and the stakes were all set. The world, unaware of these private deliberations, would soon witness events that seemed sudden, shocking, and unprecedented. But the truth is that this fallout had been building quietly, deliberately, over months, hidden beneath the surface of public appearances and media narratives. And when it finally erupted, it did so with a force that few could have anticipated. By understanding the early months of Meghan and Harry's life within the palace, we can see the contours of the story that would follow. It was a story defined by loyalty, by ambition, and by the pressures of global scrutiny. It was a story in which private conflicts became public dramas, and in which a prince's confession would alter the trajectory of a royal life forever. The fairy tale was not ending. It was evolving into something far more complex and far more compelling. But just as the public celebrated Meghan as a modern princess, a shock was looming behind palace walls. One private meeting, one critical revelation, would soon set in motion a series of events that would ultimately strip Meghan of all her royal titles and privileges. And no one outside the palace, not even her most devoted supporters, could have predicted the fallout. What happened in the weeks following this first private conflict? How did Harry's concerns escalate into a revelation that would shake Buckingham Palace to its very foundation? And what role did Meghan's actions, both public and private, play in this chain of events? The answers lie ahead, in a story of power, loyalty, and betrayal that is just beginning to unfold. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. A single meeting changed everything, an insider would later reveal. It was the kind of meeting that no one outside Buckingham Palace could have anticipated, and yet it became the pivot point for the storm that would follow. Prince Harry, having watched tensions simmer for months, finally took a step that altered the trajectory of Meghan Markle's royal standing forever. And it began with a warning. One that would reverberate through the corridors of power, behind closed doors, and eventually across the globe. Imagine the scene, a quiet, heavily secured room somewhere in the heart of the palace. The air is thick with anticipation, and the weight of centuries of tradition presses down on everyone present. Advisors, legal counsel, and members of the royal staff sit tensely, knowing that the conversation they are about to witness could change the course of history. And then Harry speaks. Firmly, clearly, and without hesitation. "I cannot keep defending Meghan," he says. The words hang in the air, simple yet seismic. Why was this warning so monumental? To understand, you need to consider the delicate balance the palace maintains. Every action, every statement, every public appearance is carefully curated. Protocol governs not only what is done, but how it is perceived. Meghan, a figure of global attention, had become a lightning rod. Polarizing, controversial, and endlessly scrutinized. The warning was not just a personal observation. It was a formal acknowledgement that her actions and decisions could no longer be contained or mitigated within the palace framework. Reports suggest that the meeting was called at Harry's initiative, a deliberate step to address concerns that had been quietly building. Advisors had observed, over time, a series of incidents that suggested misalignment between Meghan's public persona and the expectations of her role. These included public comments that contradicted palace messaging, initiatives that seemed to bypass traditional channels, and private disputes that occasionally leaked into the press. Each instance, seemingly minor on its own, formed a pattern, a cumulative effect that could not be ignored. The warning Harry delivered was both strategic and emotional. It was strategic in that it sought to protect the institution from potential damage, emotional because it exposed a fracture in loyalty. Harry, once fiercely protective of Meghan, now acknowledged that his ability to shield her had limits. Advisors reportedly listened in stunned silence as he outlined incidents that ranged from minor misunderstandings to serious breaches of protocol. He described, in detail, actions that risked public confusion, reputational damage, and internal discord. Every word underscored the urgency of the situation. One source recalls Harry emphasizing that this was not a matter of personal conflict, but of institutional responsibility. "I love Meghan," he reportedly said, voice tight with emotion. "But I cannot allow her actions to undermine everything we stand for. I had to speak up, or it would be catastrophic for the family and for the monarchy." The room was silent. For those present, the statement was a revelation. It revealed the depth of tension, the stakes involved, and the complexity of balancing love, loyalty, and duty. The palace's reaction, though restrained in public, was intense behind closed doors. Advisors immediately began assessing potential outcomes, weighing the legal, financial, and reputational consequences. Meetings were convened, notes were passed discreetly, and contingency plans were drafted. The warning had not only exposed a problem, it had forced action, and the action required careful calibration. A misstep here could ignite media scrutiny, public backlash, or worse, internal conflict that could destabilize the monarchy's carefully maintained image. But Harry's warning carried a deeper implication. It suggested that Meghan's behavior, while perhaps understandable from a personal or career-oriented perspective, had begun to erode the trust that is essential in any high-functioning institution. Trust, once broken, is difficult to repair, especially when it involves public figures whose actions are constantly under observation. By openly acknowledging that he could no longer defend her, Harry was signaling the beginning of a shift. From protection to accountability, from private advocacy to formal recognition of conflict. Interestingly, the warning also revealed an unusual dynamic within the palace. For decades, disagreements and conflicts were handled quietly, with issues resolved behind closed doors, away from the public eye. But Harry's approach was different. By articulating concerns clearly and publicly, albeit within a closed meeting, he introduced a new precedent. That private indiscretions, if sufficiently impactful, could no longer be mitigated solely through internal management. This was a subtle but profound shift, and one that would have cascading effects in the days and weeks to follow. The warning was followed by detailed discussions about how to proceed. Advisors debated the best approach, weighing diplomacy against firmness, privacy against transparency. Some argued for continued support and guidance, while others recognized that the cumulative impact of Meghan's actions required a firmer stance. Harry, positioned at the center of this debate, served as both witness and arbiter, articulating concerns and providing examples of why the status quo could no longer continue. Sources suggest that the most shocking aspect of this warning was not the incidents themselves, but Harry's framing of them. He was careful to distinguish between personal grievances and institutional risk, emphasizing that his concern was about the reputation and stability of the monarchy, not personal vendettas. This approach lent credibility to his warning, making it difficult for advisors or staff to dismiss his claims. It also laid the groundwork for the eventual decisions that would strip Meghan of her royal privileges. The warning, though private, eventually began to leak into the rumor mill as insiders with knowledge of palace dynamics began to discuss its significance. Media speculation followed, fueled by a growing sense that a dramatic revelation was imminent. Yet, the full extent of Harry's warning remained largely unknown to the public. Those outside the palace walls could not fully appreciate the gravity of what had occurred, or the tension it created between loyalty and accountability, love and duty. What makes this chapter particularly compelling is the tension between perception and reality. To the world, Meghan remained a beloved figure, commanding admiration and attention. To the palace, she had become a source of escalating concern, a symbol of conflict that could not be contained by charm or public relations alone. Harry's warning crystallized this dichotomy, bringing internal friction into sharp focus and setting the stage for the dramatic developments to come. By the time the meeting concluded, it was clear that nothing would be the same. Meghan's standing, previously unchallenged within her immediate circles, was now subject to scrutiny at the highest levels. Advisors began documenting incidents, assessing risks, and preparing for contingencies. Every subsequent decision, from media statements to internal protocol adjustments, would be influenced by the warning Harry had delivered, and yet, the story was far from over. The warning marked a beginning, not an end. It was a signal that Meghan's role in the royal family was under review, that her influence was being questioned, and that Harry's loyalty, while enduring, had limits. What remained uncertain was how Meghan would respond, how the palace would enforce boundaries, and how the public would react once these private concerns began to surface. The stakes were now higher than ever. Harry's warning had set in motion a chain reaction that would ultimately lead to Meghan being stripped of her titles and privileges. It was a reminder that even fairy tales are subject to the realities of power, tradition, and accountability. And as advisors left the meeting, quietly exchanging notes and planning next steps, one question hung in the air. What would Meghan do when she learned the full extent of the palace's response? But what came next would shock everyone. And no one could have anticipated the rapid unraveling that Harry's warning had set into motion. Was the Meghan we saw on TV the real Meghan, or just a carefully curated image? It's a question that has divided public opinion and left palace insiders whispering in corridors about the contrast between perception and reality. On one side, the world saw a modern, glamorous princess, an icon of style, philanthropy, and progressive thinking. On the other, behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, a far more complex story was unfolding, a story of tension, protocol breaches, and private conflicts that few outside the royal circle could fully grasp. From the moment Meghan stepped off a plane in London, she brought with her not just her luggage, but an aura of Hollywood confidence and independence that instantly set her apart. Cameras flashed as she smiled at the waiting press, every gesture scrutinized and magnified. Every outfit, every word, every handshake was analyzed for meaning. Social media buzzed with praise and criticism alike. Meghan was either hailed as a breath of fresh air for the monarchy or accused of disrupting centuries-old traditions. The dichotomy was immediate and striking, and it foreshadowed the tensions that would soon surface behind the palace's closed doors. Publicly, Meghan excelled. She embraced royal duties with style, charm, and apparent dedication. Charitable initiatives, speeches, and carefully staged appearances painted a picture of a compassionate, engaged, and influential royal. Headlines celebrated her humanitarian work and modern approach, framing her as a transformative figure within the monarchy. Fans called her relatable yet aspirational. Critics, however, were quick to question her motives and question her adherence to tradition. It was a delicate balance, and Meghan's public image thrived on the contrast. But private reality often diverged sharply from public perception. Insider reports indicate that Meghan's adaptation to palace life was fraught with difficulty. Unlike Hollywood sets, where creative control and personal branding are encouraged, the palace operates within strict protocols, hierarchies, and centuries of precedent. Small gestures, like questioning event arrangements, requesting changes to schedules, or seeking alternative modes of communication, were seen as challenges to established norms. Advisors and staff, accustomed to a more predictable flow, began to notice patterns of behavior that created friction behind the scenes. One palace aide recounted the tension of coordinating Meghan's early engagements. "It wasn't about rudeness," the aide said, speaking on condition of anonymity. "It was the repeated insistence on doing things differently, pushing boundaries, and expecting exceptions to protocol. It created a ripple effect that was hard to manage." And Harry was caught in the middle, trying to navigate loyalty to his wife and responsibility to the family. This dynamic, of personal ambition intersecting with institutional rigidity, formed the crucible in which tensions escalated. Perhaps the most striking contrast between public image and private reality lay in Meghan's interactions with staff and advisors. Reports suggest that some aides found her direct, sometimes demanding, and at times dismissive of established procedures. To outsiders, this may sound like minor quibbles, but within the palace, such deviations can have serious consequences. The monarchy's image relies on cohesion and consistency. Even small disruptions can cascade into public perception issues or operational inefficiencies. At the same time, Meghan's public narrative emphasized independence and strength. She portrayed herself as a champion for modernity, a woman unafraid to speak truth to power. Interviews and public statements often highlighted her resilience, her commitment to social causes, and her desire to reform traditional structures. Fans were drawn to this image. It resonated with audiences accustomed to celebrities who are outspoken, authentic, and socially conscious. But behind palace walls, these same qualities were sometimes perceived as challenges to authority, creating tension between personal expression and institutional expectation. It wasn't just interactions with staff that revealed the contrast. Private correspondence, internal memos, and confidential meetings began to document instances where Meghan's public persona diverged from internal expectations. Advisors noted inconsistencies in messaging, actions that conflicted with royal priorities, and a growing perception that the influence Meghan wielded in public spaces was not always aligned with the goals of the monarchy. Harry, acutely aware of these dynamics, found himself increasingly concerned about the long-term implications, not only for the institution, but for his own ability to navigate both personal loyalty and public responsibility. The tension between perception and reality created a feedback loop. Public acclaim emboldened Meghan's confidence, while internal friction reinforced Harry's sense of urgency. As her star rose in global media, palace advisors became more vigilant, documenting incidents and analyzing potential risks. Harry's position became increasingly complex. He needed to support his wife, maintain his own credibility, and protect the integrity of the monarchy. Balancing these competing demands required constant negotiation, both with Meghan and within the palace hierarchy. Several incidents illustrate this dichotomy vividly. During high-profile public engagements, Meghan's demeanor was polished, poised, and impeccably presented. She engaged with crowds, delivered speeches with clarity, and projected empathy and authority. Yet behind the scenes, staff recalled moments of tension, including disagreements over the framing of events, deviations from scripted protocols, and challenges to the authority of senior advisors. These moments, while largely invisible to the public, contributed to an internal narrative that Meghan's actions were increasingly difficult to manage within traditional frameworks. Complicating matters further was the relentless media scrutiny. Every public appearance was dissected, every statement analyzed, and every interaction evaluated through a lens of fascination and suspicion. Social media amplified both praise and criticism, creating a pressure cooker environment in which every decision carried outsized consequences. The contrast between Meghan's polished public image and her challenging private reality became ever more pronounced, fueling speculation and insider concern alike. Harry, observing these dynamics, began to see the necessity of intervention. Advisors recount private conversations in which he expressed frustration, concern, and ultimately a sense of inevitability. Publicly defending Meghan was no longer sufficient. The patterns he observed suggested that unchecked behavior could have far-reaching consequences. The divergence between her public image and private actions had escalated beyond simple disagreement. It had become a potential crisis for the monarchy's reputation and cohesion. The gap between public perception and private reality also extended to Meghan's personal ambitions. Insiders describe a woman acutely aware of her influence, both in the UK and internationally. Her initiatives, speeches, and public engagements position her as a prominent figure, often garnering attention that rivaled even senior members of the royal family. While these accomplishments were admirable in many respects, they also raised questions internally. Was her rising profile creating conflicts with the institution's priorities? Were certain actions being taken independently of necessary consultation? These questions, unresolved at the time, would become pivotal in the decisions that followed. One particularly illustrative example involved a high-profile charity initiative. Publicly, Meghan was celebrated for her efforts, praised for her compassion and visibility. Privately, however, advisors raised concerns that the initiative had not been coordinated fully with the palace's charitable framework, risking misalignment, duplication of effort, and internal confusion. Harry, who had championed many of Meghan's causes, recognized the dilemma. Supporting her publicly could inadvertently exacerbate internal tensions and undermine the monarchy's operational integrity. The contrast between public acclaim and private scrutiny reached a climax during one private meeting, where advisors presented Harry with a detailed assessment of potential risks. The documents outlined inconsistencies between Meghan's public statements, internal communications, and expected protocol adherence. For Harry, this was a moment of reckoning. He realized that defending Meghan without addressing these concerns could ultimately backfire, both for her and for the monarchy. This realization set the stage for the next phase of the unfolding drama. Harry's growing awareness of the gap between Meghan's public image and private reality would lead directly to a series of warnings, meetings, and decisions that culminated in her being stripped of titles and privileges. The story that the public had admired, the fairy tale princess navigating royal life with grace, was now intersecting with a reality fraught with tension, consequence, and institutional accountability. And yet, despite the growing internal concerns, Meghan's public image remained largely untarnished at this stage. The world saw a confident, modern royal navigating her duties with elegance. But behind palace walls, the narrative was far more complicated. The divergence between what was visible and what was true created a tension that would escalate, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic revelations in recent royal history. So what happened next? How did Harry transform his growing awareness into action? What specific incidents prompted him to issue warnings? And how did the palace begin preparing for the fallout that would follow? These questions would lead directly into the next chapter of this story, a chapter in which the royal warning would ignite a chain reaction that none of the participants could have fully anticipated. But what came next would change the course of Meghan's life forever and shock even her most loyal supporters. Even a prince has his limits. That's what palace insiders would later say when describing the moment Harry reached a point of no return. For months, he had been walking a tightrope, balancing his loyalty to Meghan with his responsibility to the monarchy. He had defended her publicly, privately, and in the most delicate of royal circles. He had mediated between staff and spouse, negotiated with advisors, and carefully crafted his own public image to shield her from criticism. But behind the smiles and photo ops, a storm was quietly brewing, and Harry's patience, once legendary, was running out. It began with a growing awareness of patterns. Meghan's public appearances, while seemingly flawless, were increasingly at odds with palace expectations. Small incidents, previously manageable, began accumulating into a chain of events that could no longer be ignored. Reports of protocol breaches, subtle conflicts with staff, and public statements that contradicted palace messaging created an internal pressure that Harry could not contain. The prince, long admired for his loyalty and discretion, now faced an impossible dilemma: protect the woman he loved or protect the family institution he was sworn to uphold. Imagine the psychological weight of that position. Harry was not only a royal figure, he was a son, a brother, and a husband. Every decision carried consequences, both immediate and long-term. Insiders described nights of sleepless contemplation, private conversations with advisors, and moments of intense personal reflection. He was torn, one source said. On one side, he had love and loyalty. On the other, he had duty and tradition. It was a conflict that would push anyone to their breaking point. One particularly telling incident involved a series of miscommunications around a high-profile charity initiative. Publicly, Meghan had presented herself as leading a global effort, praised in the media for her initiative and vision. Privately, however, the palace had not been fully consulted, creating friction with key advisors and staff. Harry, who had initially supported her efforts, found himself repeatedly explaining and defending actions that could have been avoided with proper communication. The constant cycle of advocacy and mitigation became exhausting, eroding his ability to remain neutral or protective without consequences. This breaking point also had a ripple effect beyond the immediate palace staff. Advisors and senior family members began preparing for the eventual consequences of Harry's stance. Contingency plans were drafted, communication strategies were developed, and legal considerations were reviewed. Harry's acknowledgement that he could no longer defend Meghan shifted internal calculations. What had once been considered minor disagreements or misunderstandings was now treated as a systemic issue, one that demanded a structured response. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of Harry's breaking point was the combination of emotion and strategy. He was not acting out of spite, revenge, or impulsiveness. Instead, his actions reflected a deliberate, measured recognition of reality, that unchecked behavior, if left unresolved, would ultimately harm everyone involved, including Meghan herself. The intersection of personal loyalty and institutional responsibility created a moment of profound consequence, one that would define the trajectory of events for months to come. And yet, despite reaching this breaking point, Harry's next moves were anything but predictable. Advisors noted that he continued to engage with Meghan privately, attempting to navigate the delicate balance between confrontation and support. He sought counsel, weighed options, and considered timing carefully. Every decision carried implications, and the stakes were higher than ever. It was a delicate dance. One misstep could lead to public fallout, media frenzy, and irreparable damage to the family's reputation. By the time this chapter of tension concluded, the groundwork had been laid for the royal warning that would follow. Harry's breaking point was not an isolated incident, but a culmination of months of observation, negotiation, and emotional struggle. It marked the moment when personal loyalty yielded to duty, when private patience gave way to decisive action, and when the first dominoes of Meghan's eventual loss of titles and privileges began to fall. The stage was now set for a series of revelations, warnings, and internal decisions that would reshape the monarchy, redefine Meghan's role, and shock both the royal household and the global audience. Harry had reached his limit. But what came next would test every assumption, every relationship, and every public perception. And what came next would shock everyone. And no one could have anticipated the rapid unraveling that Harry's breaking point had set into motion. The palace never expected this, an insider would later admit. And yet, when Prince Harry finally delivered his warning, that Meghan Markle could no longer be defended in the traditional way, the palace had no choice but to act. Behind the gilded walls, a storm of strategy, consultation, and calculated moves erupted. Every aide, advisor, and senior member of the royal household understood that this was not a routine matter of disagreement or personality clash. This was a potential crisis that could redefine the monarchy's public image, internal cohesion, and even global reputation. Imagine the scene. Corridors lined with centuries-old tapestries, advisors huddled in hushed meetings, phones buzzing with urgent messages. Legal teams consulted in corners, drafting potential responses. Senior staff reviewed precedents for handling similar, but never identical, situations. Every gesture, every word, every glance carried weight. And at the center of it all was Harry, the prince whose loyalty to Meghan had been unwavering, until it wasn't. The initial response of the palace was measured. Publicly, nothing appeared to have changed. Appearances continued as scheduled, smiles were maintained, and statements adhered strictly to carefully rehearsed narratives. But behind the scenes, the palace was in overdrive. Advisors, accustomed to managing minor scandals quietly, suddenly faced a challenge that demanded unprecedented coordination. Leaks had to be anticipated, media responses planned, and internal morale preserved, all while navigating the delicate balance of family loyalty and institutional integrity. One of the first steps taken by the palace was to gather intelligence. Confidential reports were compiled documenting Meghan's actions, public statements, and private interactions with staff. Meetings were convened with senior aides and advisors to assess the scope of potential fallout. Legal teams were brought into discussions, reviewing contracts, security arrangements, and potential implications of Meghan's role within charitable and public initiatives. Every angle was analyzed, every scenario debated. An insider describes the intensity of these internal meetings. It was like a chess game with millions of pieces. Every move had to be calculated, every reaction anticipated, and Harry had effectively thrown down a gauntlet that nobody could ignore. The palace understood that ignoring the warning was not an option. The risks of public exposure, reputational damage, or internal discontent were simply too great. Particularly concerning to palace officials was the intersection between Meghan's public persona and private actions. Outwardly, she continued to engage with charitable work, media appearances, and high-profile events. Yet internally, incidents of protocol breaches, miscommunications, and challenges to authority had accumulated. Advisors noted a pattern that suggested the potential for escalating consequences if unaddressed. Harry's warning crystallized these concerns, forcing the palace to confront what had previously been quietly managed. The palace's strategy was multi-layered. On one hand, they needed to maintain appearances. The public must perceive unity, stability, and professionalism. On the other, they had to manage internal accountability. Meghan's actions could not continue unchecked without consequences. This dual approach required delicate timing, precise messaging, and coordination across multiple levels of the household. Advisors likened it to a high-stakes operation, one that demanded both foresight and discretion. One key aspect of the palace reaction involved controlling information. Leaks, rumors, and misinterpretations were the constant threat, particularly in an era of instant global communication. The palace established strict protocols for internal communications, ensuring that sensitive details were shared only on a need-to-know basis. Meetings were carefully scheduled, phone conversations monitored, and documents marked with confidentiality. Every precaution was taken to prevent further complications, yet insiders noted that the mere existence of the warning had already set off a ripple effect that would be difficult to contain. Emotionally, the palace reaction was as complex as the strategic one. Staff and advisors reported a mix of shock, concern, and, in some cases, quiet admiration for Harry's courage. Speaking truth to power within the royal household is rare. Confronting issues with such clarity and directness is almost unheard of. Harry's warning, while internally disruptive, was also a moment of clarity, an acknowledgement that maintaining appearances could no longer mask underlying tensions. The ripple effects extended to Meghan herself, though she remained largely unaware of the full scope at first. Behind closed doors, advisors began documenting potential steps for addressing her actions, from private discussions to more formalized measures. Security protocols were reviewed, legal ramifications considered, and contingency plans developed. Every advisor understood that the palace was now operating in a new reality, one in which Meghan's behavior could not be ignored, and Harry's warning had effectively drawn a line in the sand. Interestingly, the palace reaction also highlighted internal divisions. Some members and advisors were more sympathetic to Meghan, emphasizing public perception and the potential backlash of perceived harsh treatment. Others, prioritizing tradition and institutional integrity, advocated for decisive action. The resulting dynamic created a complex negotiation, balancing loyalty, pragmatism, and optics. Harry's intervention had forced this debate into the open, and the palace was compelled to act with unprecedented speed and precision. The media, of course, was the next consideration. While Harry's warning was confidential, palace officials were acutely aware of the potential for leaks. Headlines, social media speculation, and international coverage could amplify any misstep. Strategic messaging was therefore crafted to mitigate risk, statements prepared, public appearances planned, and advisors briefed. The goal was to maintain calm externally while decisively addressing the internal reality. Every press interaction was scrutinized, and every photograph analyzed for potential narratives. Behind the scenes, senior palace officials also began revisiting historical precedents. They examined past instances of royal conflict, breaches of protocol, and high-profile scandals. Though each situation was unique, the goal was to understand potential outcomes, assess risks, and guide decision-making. Harry's warning had elevated what might have been an internal matter into a potential crisis with long-reaching consequences, and the palace's careful analysis reflected the seriousness of the situation. One source recalls a particularly intense planning session. "We were mapping scenarios like it was a military operation. Everything from media leaks to staff loyalty to public perception was considered." Harry's warning had made it clear that inaction was not an option. The focus on precision reflected both the stakes involved and the complexity of managing a high-profile family under global scrutiny. Despite the rapid mobilization, the palace also had to consider the human element. Meghan was not merely a public figure. She was a family member, a mother, and, for Harry, a spouse. Any action taken had to balance accountability with sensitivity. Advisors worked to anticipate her reaction, considering emotional responses, potential countermeasures, and public communication strategies. The emotional calculus was as important as the strategic one. One misstep could inflame tensions, create media frenzy, or destabilize Harry's position entirely. Ultimately, the palace reaction was a mix of strategy, precaution, and realpolitik. Harry's warning had illuminated a problem that could no longer be ignored. Meghan's behavior, while publicly celebrated, had created internal conflicts that demanded resolution. Advisors, legal teams, and senior staff mobilized to address the emerging crisis, developing contingency plans and preparing for a series of decisions that would reverberate across the monarchy and the world. By the end of this intense period, the palace had set the stage for what would become one of the most dramatic chapters in recent royal history. Titles, privileges, and influence were now on the table, with advisors debating the best course of action to manage both perception and consequence. Harry had made his position clear, and the palace had responded decisively. But what came next would escalate the situation even further. Private conversations would become public crises, warnings would transform into actions, and Meghan's carefully curated image would collide with the reality of palace enforcement. The reactions of the royal family and the world were only just beginning to unfold, and what came next would shock everyone, and no one could have predicted the chain reaction set in motion by the palace's response. Some secrets refused to stay hidden. That's what palace insiders say when discussing the storm that followed Harry's warning and the palace's reaction. Behind the gilded walls of Buckingham, discussions, warnings, and private conversations were meant to remain confidential. But as anyone familiar with royal history knows, the palace is a world of whispers, leaks, and carefully guarded secrets that inevitably surface. And in this case, those leaks would be pivotal, revealing shocking details about Meghan Markle and her role within the royal family, and ultimately fueling the chain of events that would strip her of every title and privilege. The first signs of trouble came in the form of private letters and internal memos. According to sources, advisors had meticulously documented incidents of misalignment, protocol breaches, and conflicts between Meghan's public persona and her private behavior. These documents were initially intended for internal review only, a factual record to guide discussions and decisions. They contained detailed accounts of meetings, engagements, and conversations that highlighted patterns of behavior increasingly seen as problematic by senior palace staff. However, some of these documents eventually leaked to select media contacts, creating a wave of speculation. While the public remained largely unaware of the palace's internal deliberations, reporters and insiders began to hint at friction within the royal household. Headlines hinted at a princess at odds with tradition, a prince forced to intervene, and a palace struggling to maintain stability. The combination of internal documentation and subtle media leaks created a pressure cooker environment, amplifying the stakes and making swift decisions unavoidable. Among the leaked materials were conversations between Harry and senior advisors, which have been described as candid emotionally charged, and revealing. In these conversations, Harry articulated frustrations and concerns that had been building for months. He spoke not only about Meghan's actions, but also about the consequences of defending them unchecked. Sources report that he emphasized the importance of institutional integrity, the potential for reputational damage, and the need for accountability, an acknowledgement that private loyalty must sometimes yield to broader responsibility. One particularly significant leaked memo detailed an incident during a private engagement where Meghan reportedly challenged staff over event arrangements. While the public saw a flawless ceremony, internal notes recorded her insistence on changes that contradicted established protocols, causing confusion and tension among aides. Harry, who had initially mediated the situation, expressed his concern that repeated incidents of this nature could not continue without consequence. The memo described his tone as measured but firm, a combination of frustration and protective concern for both Meghan and the monarchy. Another leaked conversation involved discussions of public messaging and media appearances. Harry reportedly highlighted the contradictions between Meghan's statements and the palace's official position, warning that these discrepancies could create confusion for the public and undermine the credibility of the monarchy. He argued that maintaining appearances alone was insufficient. Actions had to align with established protocols, or the institution risked reputational harm. These conversations, once leaked, fed speculation about discord behind the palace walls. The leaks also included letters written by Meghan herself, which insiders describe as revealing her intentions, frustrations, and aspirations. Some letters reportedly expressed dissatisfaction with how her initiatives were managed, while others reflected a desire for more autonomy and influence within the royal household. While the content of these letters was private, their circulation, albeit limited, fueled narratives of a princess struggling to reconcile personal ambition with institutional expectations. The combination of leaked conversations and letters created a complex picture, a woman navigating a world she had entered with confidence, but that demanded rules, restraint, and adherence to centuries of tradition. Palace staff observed that these leaks, though limited in scope, had immediate consequences. Advisors began cross-referencing the details in conversations, letters, and memos to identify patterns and assess the impact on public perception and internal cohesion. Legal teams reviewed the potential ramifications of the leaks, considering both media exposure and institutional precedent. Every leak, no matter how small, intensified the scrutiny and added urgency to the need for a coordinated response. The emotional impact on Harry was profound. According to insiders, he experienced frustration, guilt, and concern simultaneously. He was acutely aware that private discussions were now influencing public perception, creating a narrative that could be misinterpreted or exploited. At the same time, he recognized that transparency, or at least controlled exposure, was necessary to justify decisions about Meghan's role and future within the monarchy. The leaked conversations, therefore, became both a challenge and a tool, a way to illustrate concerns while managing potential fallout. What made these leaks particularly significant was not only their content, but their timing. They emerged just as tensions within the palace were reaching a peak. Harry's warning had already set the stage, the palace had reacted decisively, and now the public, albeit in a limited fashion, was beginning to glimpse the underlying conflicts. The convergence of private warnings, palace responses, and leaked documents created a narrative momentum that was impossible to halt. These leaks also exposed contradictions that fueled speculation. Publicly, Meghan appeared composed, charismatic, and aligned with royal duties. Privately, conversations and letters revealed frustration, insistence on autonomy, and at times, disagreements with established procedures. The gap between public image and private reality became increasingly evident, highlighting a tension that would define the subsequent fallout. Harry, positioned at the center, was both the messenger and the moderator, trying to balance loyalty with accountability while navigating the consequences of the leaks. Interestingly, the palace itself faced a delicate dilemma. While the leaks revealed sensitive details, they also offered an opportunity to document patterns and justify forthcoming actions. Legal and advisory teams reviewed the content meticulously, using it to support decisions that were becoming inevitable, actions that would formally limit Meghan's authority, influence, and public role within the monarchy. Each leaked document was cataloged, analyzed, and prepared for potential use in strategic decision-making. One leaked letter, in particular, reportedly caught the palace's attention. Written by Meghan to a senior advisor, it expressed her perspective on autonomy and influence within the royal household. While the letter did not contain overtly damaging content, it illustrated a mindset that conflicted with the expectations of traditional royal roles. Combined with Harry's private warnings and the cumulative pattern of behavior, this correspondence became a focal point in discussions about accountability and the future of Meghan's role. The emotional tension created by these leaks cannot be overstated. Advisors described a sense of urgency, combined with apprehension, as they considered both the short-term and long-term implications. Harry's position, already delicate, became even more critical. His perspective and testimony were essential in guiding decisions about Meghan's future. Meanwhile, Meghan herself remained largely unaware of the full extent of internal deliberations and the impact of leaked conversations, setting the stage for an inevitable confrontation with reality. By the end of this phase, the palace had fully grasped the consequences of Harry's warning, the leaks, and Meghan's behavior. Advisors had compiled detailed records, legal teams had prepared strategies, and the monarchy was poised to act decisively.